On September 30, 1919, a crowd of black sharecroppers gathered beneath the cotton-filled shadows of Bridlewood Plantation in Elaine, Arkansas, and gunfire ripped through their hopes. They had come to organize the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, desperate to wrest control of cotton prices that kept them bound to endless debt. White landowners, fearing a loss of power, summoned armed men who opened fire on the meeting, killing at least one black defender. Within hours, the plantation became a battlefield. The echo of rifles would summon a wave of terror that spread across Phillips County for an entire week. What no one could have imagined then, what would remain hidden for decades, was how this single clash ignited a coordinated campaign of white mob violence, state-sponsored raids, and a legal nightmare that reached the nation's highest court. The story of Elaine is not merely a local tragedy. It is a stark illustration of how institutional racism can turn ordinary law enforcement into an instrument of genocide. The meeting at Bridlewood was more than a gathering. It was a bold assertion of agency by men like Willis H.B. Moore, a respected sharecropper who had spent years toiling under the same cotton contracts that kept his family impoverished. When Moore stood before his fellow laborers and spoke of collective bargaining, he gave voice to a simmering resentment that had been building since the end of World War I. White landowners, led by influential planters in Phillips County, perceived the Union as an existential threat. They called upon local sheriffs and private armed men, framing the assembly as a dangerous insurrection. The first shots were fired not from a distant hill, but from within the crowd of white men who had slipped into the plantation's fields under the pretense of protecting property. One black defender fell, panic erupted, and the sharecroppers returned fire. The brief exchange left blood on the cotton rows and set off a chain reaction that would engulf an entire region. Within 24 hours of the Bridlewood shootout, white mobs, some organized, others spontaneous, began sweeping through Phillips County with the tacit approval of state authorities. Arkansas state troopers, ostensibly deployed to restore order, marched alongside armed civilians, raiding black neighborhoods, churches, and farms. Contemporary reports in the Arkansas Gazette described a storm of violence that left entire families fleeing into the swamps or hiding beneath floorboards. Estimates of the death toll vary dramatically. The Chicago Defender, reporting from the front lines of black journalism, claimed that hundreds have been slain, while local white newspapers refused to publish any numbers at all. Modern historians, after painstakingly cross-referencing coroners' reports, burial records, and oral testimonies, place the Black Death toll anywhere between 100 and 800 souls, an indeterminate range that underscores the deliberate erasure of these lives from official counts. No white perpetrators were ever arrested or charged. The violence was treated as a necessary act to preserve the social order. In the aftermath of the massacre, 12 black men, including Willis H.B. Moore, were arrested on fabricated murder charges. None of the white attackers faced any legal scrutiny. The trials were conducted by hastily convened courts that ignored basic due process rights. Jurors, all white, and selected from the very communities that had perpetrated the killings, handed down death sentences without credible evidence. The NAACP, alarmed by the miscarriage of justice, dispatched attorney Scipio Jones to represent the condemned men. Jones faced a legal system stacked against him. No transcripts of the original shootings, witnesses who were either intimidated or dead, and a state government that had already called in federal troops to maintain peace, a phrase that in practice meant protecting white vigilantes. Yet the NAACP persisted, filing appeals that would eventually climb to the Supreme Court. The case reached the nation's highest court under the title United States v. Moore, 1923. The central issue was not the guilt or innocence of the 12 men, but whether they had been denied their constitutional right to counsel, a right that, until then, had been inconsistently applied in cases involving black defendants. In a landmark decision, the court affirmed that every accused individual, regardless of race, is entitled to effective legal representation. While this ruling marked a significant victory for civil rights jurisprudence, it did little to address the underlying atrocity at Elaine. The Supreme Court's focus on procedural safeguards left the mass murder itself unexamined, allowing Arkansas officials to continue denying any official death count or acknowledgement of responsibility. The decision, however, set a precedent that would later empower future generations of activists fighting for equal justice under law. For decades after the violence, textbooks across Arkansas omitted any mention of Elaine. In the 1970s, a handful of local historians began to unearth newspaper archives, court documents, and oral histories that painted a fuller picture of the massacre. Yet even then, state curricula resisted inclusion, relegating the event to footnotes or dismissing it as isolated unrest. The Arkansas Gazette never published an official tally. The Chicago Defender continued to be the primary source for black families seeking answers about missing relatives. This deliberate silence served a dual purpose. It protected white community leaders from accountability and reinforced a narrative that African Americans were perpetual agitators rather than victims of systemic oppression. The absence of Elaine from public memory illustrates how institutional forces can shape collective consciousness by deciding what is remembered and what is forgotten. The legacy of the Elaine Massacre reverberates today in ongoing debates over voting rights, labor organization, and racial justice in the American South. Modern movements that advocate for farm workers' rights often cite Elaine as a cautionary tale of how economic exploitation can intertwine with violent suppression. Moreover, recent efforts to rename public spaces and erect memorials have sparked discussions about how societies reckon with dark chapters of their past. Yet many questions remain unanswered. How many bodies were never recovered? Which white officials orchestrated the raids under the guise of order? And why did it take nearly a century for Arkansas to formally acknowledge the tragedy? These open loops continue to fuel scholarly research, community activism, and a growing demand for truth, telling that confronts rather than conceals history. The story of Elaine is a stark reminder that violence against black communities has often been sanctioned by the very institutions meant to protect them. From the deployment of federal troops that effectively aided white vigilantes, to courts that sentenced innocent men while ignoring the murderers, every layer of authority participated in an orchestrated denial of justice. As we look back, the silence that once shrouded Elaine becomes a call to action, to demand accurate histories, to honor those whose lives were erased, and to ensure that legal protections extend beyond procedural rights to substantive accountability. The massacre may have been buried for generations, but its shadows linger in the collective conscience of Arkansas and the nation. By confronting this past, we illuminate a path toward a future where such atrocities are neither repeated nor forgotten.